It started with a sound no one should ever hear out on the plains. A strained, muffled wheezing, the kind that doesn't belong to the living wilderness. The morning sun had barely crested the tall ridgeline east of Bitterroot Valley, Montana,
He won't let us near him.
when that sound
He's
echoed from the roadside grass, brittle and
guarding
pale
him.
after a long, dry summer. If you crouched low enough beside that cracked county road, the one that meandered between miles of ranch land and faded highway signs, you'd spot a crumpled plastic jug, half buried in weeds. But the jug moved. It wheezed. And inside, clouded behind scratched plastic and dried soda residue, were the pleading, glassy eyes of a mountain lion cub. His name, later given by the team that would fight for his life, was Ash. 4 months old, his fur was the color of burnt wheat, and around his neck the rigid mouth of a plastic bottle had cut deep into the skin, leaving raw, angry flesh. Every breath sounded like gravel scraping a rusted pipe. Next to him, nearly invisible in the tall grass, was his brother, Cedar. Slightly smaller, with darker tufts at his ears and a more cautious gaze, Cedar lay with his front paws tucked under his chest and his eyes fixed on Ash. Every few seconds, he rose to lick the bloody line where the bottle choked his brother's throat, then whined softly, almost apologetically, into the breeze. 3 days earlier, these two had been nothing more than mischievous shadows, tumbling through the high grass under the quiet watch of their mother. She'd left them tucked between a patch of fallen pine trunks while she hunted mule deer near the riverbed. But cubs don't understand danger the way a mother does. And when a wayward butterfly, bright as a flame, fluttered past the woodpile, Ash chased it. Cedar followed, and neither looked back. They ran, through meadow, past fence posts, into the forgotten edge of land where cattle once grazed, but now only wind and trash remained. The north border of the Bitterroot Wildlife Corridor wasn't fenced like it should have been. Blown plastic bags hung from sagebrush like strange fruit. Rusted soda cans glittered among thistles, and near an old barbed wire crossing, someone had tossed a bulk-size plastic soda bottle, its inside still sticky with syrup. Ash, the bolder of the two, couldn't resist. He sniffed it once, pawed it twice, and before Cedar could growl out a warning, Ash plunged his head inside. Maybe it was the sweet smell. Maybe it was the narrow bottleneck and the cub's still small skull. Either way, when Ash tried to pull back, it didn't budge. He screamed, a tiny, choked cry that sent birds into flight. Cedar panicked, circling, pawing, even biting at the bottle. But the more Ash struggled, the tighter the plastic dug in. Blood seeped from the pressure ring forming at the base of his skull. And after hours of thrashing, against rocks, logs, even an old fence post, Ash collapsed. Cedar didn't leave, not that day, not the night after. Under Montana's star-choked sky, where temperatures dropped fast once the sun dipped, the cubs huddled together in silence. Ash's breath rattled. Cedar curled close, his small body trembling. From fear, from cold, from hunger. Somewhere out there, their mother searched. But the wind carried no scent back to her. The next day, Ash was weaker. The plastic now fogged from inside, the once clear view warped by grime and crusted sap. He couldn't see, couldn't drink, couldn't eat. His strength faded like the morning frost under sun. But Cedar, hungry, scared, alone, never wandered far. He found a patch of dew on a flat rock and licked at it. Then gently, carefully, he tried to drip the moisture between the bottle and his brother's throat. Only a few drops got through. But it was something. That afternoon, Cedar made his first kill. A grass mouse, slow from the heat. He didn't eat it. Instead, he carried it to Ash, dropped it at his paws, and waited. When Ash couldn't respond, Cedar whimpered, then reluctantly swallowed the meal himself. It gave him just enough energy to try again, to keep going. But by the time the third day dawned, Ash could no longer stand. His legs buckled, his sides heaved. The bottle had warped his breathing, and infection had taken hold in the torn flesh. Cedar pawed at him, licked him, nuzzled him forward. And somehow, Ash moved, inch by inch, toward a scent they'd both long feared, human smoke. By mid-morning of the third day, the Montana sun had already climbed high enough to bleach the landscape in a pale, unforgiving light. The distant mountains shimmered in the heat. But here, at the low slope where the road curved toward a weather-beaten cattle gate, the shadows of two cubs crept through the brittle grass. Ash could barely move. His once nimble legs now wobbled under the weight of exhaustion, and the plastic prison still lodged around his neck. His breaths were shallow, and each step left him gasping. The bottle was scratched from inside and out, its surface smeared with dirt and sap, making it nearly opaque now. And still, Cedar stayed by his side. He didn't push hard. He didn't drag. Instead, he gently nudged Ash's side whenever the bigger cub collapsed, licking his ear, his cheek, his wound. Anything to keep him grounded in the world. Cedar had always been the quiet one, the one who let Ash climb first, eat first, lead the way. But now, he was the only reason Ash was still breathing. It took them nearly 4 hours to reach the edge of the asphalt. The last patch of tall grass gave way to a gravel shoulder where the wind tugged at loose wrappers and beer cans. From the brush, Cedar looked out onto the 2-lane road that cut across the northern edge of the reserve, a road rarely used since the old lumber mill closed down. But now and then, a truck still passed. Cedar stepped onto the shoulder, ears pricked, body alert. Then he turned, walked back, and sat beside Ash, and waited for an hour, then another. A red pickup rumbled by around noon. Cedar flinched and ducked into the grass, but returned the moment it was gone. He licked Ash's ear again. The bottle let out a soft wheeze as Ash tried to breathe through the narrowing air passage. By the time the sky started to tint gold, Cedar made a choice. He climbed fully onto the road, a small silhouette against the evening light. His fur bristled, and his tail was low, but he sat down just a few feet from the road's center line. His ears flicked with every sound, every bird call, every passing breeze. And then, with a voice that barely sounded like a mountain lion at all, he began to cry out. It wasn't a roar. It wasn't even a growl. It was something more vulnerable, a rhythmic, high-pitched mewling sound, like a kitten lost in a thunderstorm. The sound carried, across the road, through the empty pasture, into the cabin of a dusty white pickup truck that had just crested the hill beyond the turn. Inside that truck were Dr. Margaret Lane, a wildlife biologist known across Montana for her studies of wildcats, and Walt Henry, a retired ranger who volunteered for the Bitterroot Wildlife Conservancy. They were headed to the North Observation Post, just like they did every Thursday morning. Walt's fingers tightened around the wheel. Did you hear that? Margaret had already rolled down her window, another soft cry. Then silence. Then again. Stop, she said, already unbuckling. Walt pulled onto the shoulder. Gravel crunched under the tires. From the side mirror, they both caught it. A small, tawny figure, ears perked, sitting completely still. And behind it, almost invisible at first, another cub, collapsed in the grass, his head distorted by a strange, round shape. My God, Margaret whispered. Is that a bottle? Walt grabbed the radio. We need wildlife rescue at mile marker 212, Northern Boundary Road. 2 cubs, 1 in critical distress. He rattled off coordinates with practiced urgency. Margaret was already digging out her binoculars. Her breath hitched. It's tight around the neck. He's been stuck for days. The younger one's guarding him. As if confirming her words, Cedar rose to his feet the moment the door opened. He didn't run. He didn't snarl. He simply stood between them and Ash, body trembling. but gaze firm. "This is not instinct," Margaret murmured. "This is something else." Within 15 minutes, a second truck skidded onto the scene. This one green, marked with the Conservancy seal. Inside were 2 veterinarians, an animal behaviorist, and a tranquilizer specialist. They parked well back, assessing from a distance. "That little guy won't let us get close without a fight," the vet warned. "We'll need to sedate them both." Tranquilizer darts were prepped. Light doses, just enough to bring them down gently. The specialist stepped out, aimed carefully. 1 shot, 2. The dart struck with soft thuds. Cedar jerked at the sting, let out a startled cry. But instead of fleeing, he staggered forward and tried to shield Ash, planting himself awkwardly in front of the motionless form. Only when his legs gave out did he finally lie down, head still tilted toward his brother, watching. The team waited for the drugs to take full effect. Then, with slow, practiced movements, they moved in. As the vets approached Ash, one gasped audibly. The bottle's edge had dug in deep, almost to the muscle. The cub's body was shockingly thin, his ribs visible. The wound was open and angry, surrounded by dirt and flies. The smell of infection clung to him like smoke. This is bad," one murmured. They began cutting the bottle away, careful, deliberate, using heated wire tools to avoid further trauma. The final ring snapped with a soft pop, and suddenly the cub's face was free. Everyone froze. The damage was worse than expected. But he was alive, barely. "Get fluids going. Antibiotics. We'll stabilize and transport," Margaret ordered. "Bring them both." On the stretcher, Cedar and Ash were placed side by side. Even in sedation, Cedar's paw slid across to touch his brother's flank. No one said anything for a long moment. And then Margaret whispered, "They stayed together. Through all of it." Walt nodded. "That little one. He never gave up." And with the sun setting over the endless Montana plains, the convoy turned toward the rescue center. The fight had only just begun. The Bitterroot Wildlife Rescue Center wasn't a flashy facility, just a cluster of modular buildings set against a backdrop of rolling hills and scattered pine. A few decades ago, it had been a ranger outpost. Now, it served as one of the last lines of defense between wild creatures and the human world they too often stumbled into. That night, the center didn't sleep. Ash was rushed straight into the treatment wing. Overhead fluorescents buzzed. 2 veterinarians, Dr. Rosa Cheng, an emergency specialist flown in from Missoula, and Dr. Samuel Green, the center's senior vet, worked side by side. The moment the last piece of that bottle came off, they saw the full extent of the damage. The plastic had carved a raw, swollen trench nearly halfway around Ash's neck. Tissue was necrotic in some spots. In others, infection had already set in. His breathing was labored. His eyes were glazed. He hadn't eaten in nearly 3 days. Fluids were immediately hooked into a vein in his back leg, antibiotics administered, oxygen gently delivered through a tiny nasal tube. Rosa muttered, "1 more hour and we'd be too late." Meanwhile, Cedar had been placed in a large observation kennel, just a few feet away. He was waking first, blinking slowly under the dim light, his muscles twitching from the sedative. When he realized where he was, the walls, the scent of antiseptic, the distant hum of machines, he panicked for a moment. Then he caught Ash's scent. He scrambled up to the cage door, letting out low, sharp chirps. Not threatening, calling. The sound pierced through the glass of the operating room. Samuel looked up. "That's him. That's the one who stayed." Margaret had stayed too. She stood at the viewing window, arms folded, eyes misted but sharp. She turned to Dr. Green. "We need to put them together. That cub's not just company. He's the reason the other one's alive." Rosa frowned. "It's risky. Post-op infection is no joke. One wrong bump." "He won't bump," Margaret said softly. "He'll guard." After deliberation and a quick vet meeting, they agreed. Under strict monitoring, Cedar could be placed with Ash once the surgery was done and the neck bandage secured. When Ash was wheeled into the adjoining recovery pen, Cedar was already pacing in tight circles. The moment the cage door opened, he bolted across the space and stopped just short of Ash's flank. His nose quivered. His ears twitched. Then, gently, slowly, he pressed his body alongside his brother's and laid his head across Ash's paw, the one not hooked to tubes and tape. Everyone watching, vet, ranger, biologist, stopped breathing for a second. It was such a human moment, so familiar, so sacred. Cedar didn't move again that night, and by dawn he had shifted only to curl tighter around Ash's recovering frame. In the days that followed, Ash's condition teetered on the edge. He ran fevers. His wound oozed and had to be flushed every few hours. He didn't eat on his own. He winced whenever the bandage was changed. But through it all, Cedar remained. When Ash stirred in his sleep, Cedar was there to nuzzle him. When nurses came with food trays, Cedar sniffed everything before letting Ash even attempt a lick. At one point, when Ash whimpered from the pain of a physical checkup, Cedar snapped his teeth, not in aggression, but in warning. Careful. He matters. Margaret began documenting the behavior in a leather notebook. "We study wildcats for their instinct," she wrote one night. "But here, I think we're seeing something beyond that. Devotion, not for territory, not for survival, for love." On the fourth day, Ash licked a slurry of ground meat and bone broth from a shallow bowl. On the sixth, he stood for 10 seconds unassisted. By the end of the second week, he could walk in slow circles around the pen. His wound was healing, still raw, but closed. His eyes had cleared. But the most telling sign of progress was something much simpler. He purred, not loudly, not like a house cat, but a soft, steady rumble that echoed into Cedar's ribs as they lay curled together, just like the first night they'd arrived. Meanwhile, word of the cubs had begun to spread. It started with a photo. Cedar curled against Ash in recovery, one paw draped across the other's shoulder, like a little brother refusing to let go. Margaret had sent it to a friend in Bozeman. Within a day, it was on a local news site. Then NPR picked it up. Then the headline spread across conservation forums. "Rescue in Bitterroot, the mountain lion brothers who refused to part." And beneath the photo, a caption, "Ash and Cedar, a bond deeper than instinct." Thousands shared the story. Donations poured into the rescue center. Handwritten letters arrived from school children in Kansas and retirees in Oregon. A class of 5th graders in Idaho mailed a giant hand-drawn "Get Well Soon" card with cartoon lions on the cover and a note that read, "We think your brother is a hero." Walt, who normally hated attention, just grunted. "Damn right he is." By the start of the third week, Ash was ready to leave the recovery unit. Not completely healed, the wound around his neck still bore a pink scar, and his fur hadn't grown back fully, but strong enough to move, to eat, to play again. And Cedar? He was pacing. Not in the nervous, anxious way he had during those first long nights. This time, it was restlessness, the kind that spoke of instinct, a tug in the bones that said, "It's time to go home." Dr. Green noticed it first. "He's starting to scan the door every time we walk in," he said during morning rounds. "His instincts are pulling at him. He wants out. He wants home." Margaret stood quietly by the edge of the pen, arms crossed. It's time then. So the team began planning the release. But there was a question that loomed over every meeting, every chart, every whispered hallway conversation. Should they try to reunite the cubs with their mother and pride? Lions, especially the mountain lions in this part of Montana, were famously elusive, solitary for the most part. But it was known that mothers often returned to the last place they saw their cubs for weeks, even months, calling softly in the dusk. Margaret had a hunch, one that had kept her up at night. And so, for 5 evenings in a row, Walt and two tracking interns ventured out toward the northwest quadrant of the Bitterroot Wildlife Corridor, the area where the cubs had been found. They laid trail cameras, recorded audio, used playback of lion calls. On the sixth night, just after dusk, the camera near a pine bluff caught it. A female mountain lion, large, healthy, her belly tucked with signs of recent nursing. She circled the edge of the clearing, sniffed the ground, and let out a low, rolling chirp. Not a warning, not a growl, a call. "She's looking for them," Walt said quietly, reviewing the footage. She never stopped. 2 days later, the convoy rolled out before dawn. It was a short ride, just under 30 minutes, but every bump in the road felt loaded. The back of the truck had been modified with a large release cage, padded and open to filtered air. Ash and Cedar lay inside, alert but calm, their bodies pressed together like always. Dr. Rosa checked Ash's vitals one more time. The scar around his neck was now clean and dry, though slightly raised. She ran a hand gently along his spine. "You made it," she whispered. Margaret stood beside Walt at the edge of the tree line. She'd chosen the drop-off site carefully, a quiet meadow sloping into forest, just 2 ridges west of where the mother lion had been spotted. It wasn't too close to human scent trails, but near enough to the pride's territory for the cubs to pick up familiar smells. Walt walked over to the cage, rope in hand. "Ready?" No one answered, but everyone nodded. The cage door creaked open, and then, nothing. For several long seconds, Ash and Cedar just sat there. Their ears flicked, their nostrils flared, but their bodies didn't move. The open space was too big, too bright, too uncertain. Then Cedar stepped forward, just one paw out of the crate. He paused, sniffed the breeze, and then turned back to Ash. With a low, guttural chirp, the same sound their mother had once used to call them in for naps, he beckoned. Ash blinked, then stood. Together, they stepped onto the grass, first slowly, then side by side, tails twitching in quiet rhythm. They made their way toward the trees. No one spoke. Through binoculars, Margaret watched as they reached the first line of pine. Ash paused, his head lifted high. Cedar crouched beside him, scanning the wind. And then, from deep within the forest, a single sound echoed. Soft, low, familiar, a mother's call. The brothers froze. Then, without hesitation, they broke into a trot, not frantic, not wild, just certain. They disappeared into the tree line as the sun crested the mountain's shoulder, gold light pouring through the branches behind them. Margaret exhaled for the first time in what felt like days. "They're going to be okay," she said. Walt nodded, his voice gruff. "They already are." Back at the center, the release was logged. Ash's medical file was marked closed, returned to wild. Cedar's entry was labeled uninjured, refused separation. The story didn't end there, of course. It spread, not just through wildlife forums or Montana news, but into classrooms, town halls, social media feeds. Conservationists used it as a rallying cry to push for better waste control in rural areas. A local brewery even launched a limited edition beer called Brothers Bond, with proceeds going toward wildlife rescue programs. And in a glass case at the Bitterroot Visitors Center, right beside a photo of the 2 cubs curled together in the clinic pen, sat a warped, cracked plastic soda bottle. A label beneath it read, "This nearly cost a life." But it also showed us something we forgot. The wild doesn't just survive. Sometimes it loves. Winter came early that year in Montana. The valleys filled with frost, and the tree lines turned brittle and white by the second week of October. Wildlife sightings slowed. The tracking cameras set near the northwest corridor of the reserve recorded fewer movements. Elk herds shifting, the occasional black bear preparing for hibernation. But in mid-November, just as snowfall dusted the ridgelines, something happened. One of the new interns, a soft-spoken wildlife student from Oregon named Joanna Lee, was reviewing overnight footage when she froze. 2 mountain lions. Cubs, but older now, stronger, moving together through the frost-covered meadow just half a mile from the original release site. They moved in unison, alert but relaxed, their bodies lean and muscular now, their gaits confident. One of them, the slightly larger one, paused at a fallen log and turned his head just enough to let the camera catch a faint glint of light against a faint scar along his neck. Joanna gasped. "It's them," she whispered. "Ash and Cedar." The video made its way around the center within an hour. By noon, Margaret, Rosa, Walt, and half the staff had gathered in the meeting room to watch. They didn't cheer, they didn't cry, not out loud. But something settled in the air that day, a kind of reverence. Ash was alive. Cedar was still by his side. And somewhere beyond that lens, their mother likely still watched over them too. Her own quiet miracle. 6 months later, the Montana Wildlife Alliance launched a statewide campaign titled Not Just Instinct. It featured Ash and Cedar as its central story, the bond between 2 wild brothers that defied everything we thought we knew about survival, family, and emotion in the animal kingdom. There were posters, classroom materials, even a children's book in the works. Schools across the Northwest ran environmental workshops using the story as a central case study. And park rangers began hosting Ash and Cedar cleanup days, where local families would hike into the forests to remove human trash from the wild. Walt, despite being camera shy and famously cranky, agreed to speak at the Alliance's annual fundraiser. He took the podium, cleared his throat, and said, "I've seen a lot of things in my years out here. Bears wrestling with deer carcasses, wolves trailing elk over 2 counties. But I've never seen what I saw that day on the roadside. A cub that refused to leave his brother. We think we're the only ones who feel love. That we're the ones who sacrifice, who worry, who stay through the night." But Cedar stayed. And because he stayed, Ash lived. Silence followed his speech. Then a standing ovation. Back at the visitor center, just beyond the map of the wildlife corridor, sat a new exhibit. Simple, quiet, tucked beside the ranger desk. Inside the case, a cracked soda bottle, sealed and cleaned. The chewed remains of the tranquilizer dart that had sedated Cedar. And 2 paw prints cast in plaster side by side. A small plaque read, "Ash and Cedar Brothers, Survivors, Symbols." They reminded us that sometimes the strongest instinct of all is love. Out in the hills, no one knows exactly where the brothers are now, but trail cameras still catch glimpses. 2 mountain lions traveling as one, strong, free, and always together.